At 9:47 a.m. Eastern Time on a Tuesday morning, Michael Steele, the former chairman of the Republican National Committee, delivered a statement that cut through the political noise with surgical precision. He stood before cameras and spoke with the authority of someone who had spent decades inside the machinery of American conservative politics. What he said was direct. What he said was unambiguous. Michael Steele stated publicly that Donald Trump believed Americans would accept his post, a post that Steele himself characterized as racist. Those words landed with weight. They landed because of who was saying them. This was not a Democratic strategist. This was not a liberal commentator. This was a man who once led the Republican Party, a man who understood its voters, its messaging, and its calculations. And he was now on the record saying that Trump had made a specific assumption about the American public, an assumption that they would tolerate language that crossed a line. Now let me show you exactly how this unfolded, what was said, and why this moment carries consequences that extend far beyond any single news cycle. To understand the significance of Steele's statement, you first need to understand the post itself. Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States and current political figure, published content on his social media platform that immediately generated reaction. The post addressed immigration, specifically targeting migrants and using language that critics immediately flagged as dehumanizing. The words were not accidental. The phrasing was not spontaneous. This was a crafted message released at a calculated time designed to reach millions of followers within minutes. And it did. The post spread across platforms, was screenshotted, shared, and debated before most Americans had finished their morning coffee. Here's why this matters. When a former president with a massive following publishes content of this nature, it does not exist in a vacuum. It enters the national conversation. It shapes how people talk. It moves the boundaries of acceptable discourse. And in this case, according to Michael Steele, it was published with an expectation that the public would not push back, that they would absorb it, normalize it, and move on. Michael Steele did not soften his language. He did not hedge. Speaking on MSNBC, where he serves as a political analyst, Steele stated clearly that Trump operated under a belief that Americans had become conditioned to accept inflammatory rhetoric. Steele described this as a miscalculation, but also as a revealing one. In his view, Trump's willingness to post such content demonstrated a specific understanding of the electorate, one that assumed tolerance for what Steele explicitly called racist messaging. Those are Steele's words. That is his characterization, and it carries weight precisely because Steele is not an outsider to conservative politics. He ran the RNC from 2009 to 2011. He oversaw the party during a period of significant electoral success, including the 2010 midterm wave. He knows how Republican messaging works. He knows how base voters respond. And he is now publicly stating that Trump believed he could push boundaries without consequence. That statement alone represents a significant moment in the ongoing political conversation about rhetoric, race, and responsibility in American public life. Let me take you back through the timeline with precision. The post appeared early in the day. Within 30 minutes, political reporters had flagged it. Within 1 hour, Democratic members of Congress had issued statements condemning the language. Within 2 hours, civil rights organizations had released formal responses. Within 3 hours, the story had reached cable news, where it dominated morning programming. And within 4 hours, Michael Steele was on air delivering his assessment. This is the speed of modern political controversy. There is no waiting period. There is no cooling off time. Content is published and the machine of reaction activates immediately. But here's what separates this particular cycle from countless others. The criticism came from inside the House. Michael Steele's commentary was not predictable opposition. It was a former party leader offering a structural critique of a former president's strategic assumptions. That distinction matters. That distinction is why this story has staying power. Now let me show you the specific language Steele used, because precision matters here. Steele stated that Trump believed, in his words, that Americans would simply accept the racist nature of his post. He went further. He suggested that this belief reflected a broader pattern, a pattern in which Trump tests the limits of public tolerance, measures the reaction, and adjusts accordingly. Steele characterized this as a form of political conditioning, where repeated exposure to inflammatory content gradually raises the threshold for outrage. According to Steele, Trump operates with an understanding that each controversial statement paves the way for the next, that the audience becomes desensitized over time, This is not a new theory. Political scientists and media researchers have studied this phenomenon extensively. But hearing it articulated by a former RNC chairman directed specifically at a former Republican president adds a different dimension to the conversation. It transforms academic observation into political accusation. The reaction to Steele's comments was immediate and divided along predictable lines. Supporters of the former president dismissed the criticism as expected antagonism from someone they view as disloyal to the party he once led. Critics of the former president amplified Steele's words as validation of concerns they had been raising for years. But here's what cuts through the partisan noise. Steele was not speaking in generalities. He was making a specific claim about a specific post and a specific assumption he attributed to Trump's calculation. That specificity is what gives the statement weight. It is not an abstract complaint. It is a direct assertion about intent and expectation. And because Steele has the background he has, because he carries the credentials of someone who operated at the highest levels of Republican politics, his words cannot be easily dismissed as mere opposition rhetoric. Here's why this matters beyond the news cycle. The question of what language is acceptable in American political discourse has been contested for decades, but the Trump era accelerated that contestation dramatically. Statements that would have ended political careers in previous generations became fodder for debate rather than disqualification. The boundaries moved. They moved because audiences accepted the movement, or at least did not reject it with sufficient force to impose consequences. Michael Steele's commentary addresses this phenomenon directly. He is saying explicitly that Trump made a bet on American tolerance. He is saying that Trump believed the public would absorb content that previous generations would have rejected. And he is saying that this belief, this assumption, reveals something important about how Trump views the electorate. Whether you agree with Steele's characterization or reject it entirely, the fact that a former RNC chairman is making this argument publicly represents a significant data point in the ongoing story of American political culture. Let me now walk you through the broader context that makes this moment significant. Michael Steele's break with the Trump wing of the Republican Party did not happen overnight. It evolved over years, through a series of public statements, cable news appearances, and increasingly direct criticisms. Steele has described himself as a traditional Republican, someone committed to conservative principles, but unwilling to subordinate those principles to loyalty to any individual. This positioning has made him a controversial figure within his former party. To some, he is a principled voice willing to speak uncomfortable truths. To others, he is a disgruntled former official seeking relevance through opposition. But regardless of how you view his motivations, his credentials are not in dispute. He led the Republican National Committee. He raised hundreds of millions of dollars for Republican candidates. He helped engineer electoral victories that shaped the political landscape for years. When he speaks about Republican strategy, he speaks from experience. And when he accuses a Republican president of making calculated assumptions about racial tolerance, that accusation carries a weight that cannot be replicated by outside critics. What happens next is where this story intersects with larger questions about accountability and consequence. In previous eras of American politics, statements characterized as racist by figures of Steele's stature would trigger specific institutional responses. Party leaders would distance themselves. Donors would reconsider their support. Editorial boards would issue condemnations, but the current landscape operates differently. The fragmentation of media, the polarization of audiences, and the loyalty structures within the Republican base have created conditions where criticism from figures like Steele may generate headlines without generating consequences. This is the dynamic Steele himself is describing. He is arguing that Trump understood this dynamic, that Trump made a calculation based on it, and that Trump's post was the product of that calculation. Whether that calculation proves correct depends on what happens in the coming days and weeks. It depends on whether the story sustains attention. It depends on whether other Republican voices join Steele's critique or remain silent. It depends on whether the public responds with the indifference Trump allegedly expected or with something more forceful. Now let me address the specific content of the post that generated this controversy, because the substance matters as much as the reaction. The post in question addressed immigration using language that characterized migrants in terms that critics immediately identified as dehumanizing. The specific words matter less than the pattern they represent. Over years of public communication, Trump has developed a rhetorical approach to immigration that emphasizes threat, invasion, and contamination. This language has been consistent. It has been deliberate, and it has been effective in mobilizing certain segments of the electorate. Critics argue that this language crosses from policy disagreement into racial demonization. Supporters argue that it reflects legitimate concerns about border security expressed in direct terms. Michael Steele, in his commentary, sided firmly with the critics. He used the word racist. He applied it directly to the post. And he made the additional claim that Trump expected this characterization to be overridden by public acceptance. That layered critique, addressing both the content and the calculation behind it, is what distinguishes Steele's commentary from more routine criticism. Here's what the historical record shows about the consequences of inflammatory political rhetoric. In 1964, Barry Goldwater's opposition to the Civil Rights Act, framed in terms of constitutional principle rather than racial animus, nonetheless cost him significant support and contributed to a landslide defeat. In 1988, the Willie Horton advertisement, which critics characterized as racially coded fear-mongering, generated backlash even as it arguably helped George H.W. Bush win the presidency. In 2012, Mitt Romney's 47% comments, secretly recorded and widely distributed, damaged his campaign and reinforced narratives about Republican indifference to working-class concerns. These examples demonstrate that rhetoric carries consequences, but those consequences are neither automatic nor uniform. They depend on context, on timing, and on the broader political environment. What Steele is arguing is that Trump has navigated this landscape more successfully than previous figures, not by avoiding controversial statements, but by betting that the consequences would not materialize. And that bet, according to Steele, reveals a troubling assumption about what Americans will accept. The institutional response to Trump's post followed patterns that had become familiar. Democratic elected officials issued statements of condemnation within hours. Civil rights organizations released formal responses calling for accountability. Media outlets covered the controversy extensively, with commentary divided along predictable ideological lines. But here's what's notable about the Republican response, or rather, the absence of it. With limited exceptions, Republican elected officials did not address the post directly. They did not echo Steele's characterization. They did not defend the language. They simply remained silent, allowing the news cycle to move forward without their participation. This pattern of non-response has itself become a subject of analysis. Critics argue that silence functions as tacit acceptance, that the failure to condemn normalizes what should be condemned. Defenders argue that elected officials are not obligated to respond to every controversy, that selective engagement is a legitimate political strategy. Michael Steele, in his commentary, implicitly addressed this dynamic. He suggested that Trump's expectation of acceptance extended not just to the public but to Republican leadership, that he anticipated their silence and factored it into his calculation. Let me now explain why this moment matters beyond the individuals involved. The question of racial rhetoric in American politics is not new. It predates Trump. It will outlast Trump. But the Trump era has brought this question to the forefront in ways that have permanent implications for how American political discourse operates. Every election cycle, every policy debate, every act of political communication now occurs in an environment shaped by the precedents established over the past decade. What leaders say, what audiences accept, and what institutions tolerate collectively define the boundaries of acceptable discourse. Those boundaries are not fixed. They move, and they move based on what happens in moments like this one. Michael Steele's public statement represents one attempt to hold the line, to assert that certain language remains unacceptable regardless of who speaks it or how audiences respond. Whether that assertion has any effect depends on whether it is echoed by others, whether it generates sustained attention, and whether it translates into tangible consequences. The history of American politics suggests that rhetorical accountability is possible but not guaranteed. It requires effort. It requires repetition. It requires institutional support. And it requires a public willing to impose costs on those who cross established lines. What we are witnessing is a contest over those lines. On one side are voices like Michael Steele, who argue that certain forms of rhetoric violate fundamental norms and should be identified as such. On the other side are voices who argue that accusations of racism are themselves a political tactic designed to silence legitimate debate and stigmatize opponents. This contest is not resolvable through a single news cycle or a single statement. It unfolds over time, through accumulated choices and accumulated consequences. But each moment like this one contributes to the trajectory. Each public statement, each institutional response, each act of silence or condemnation becomes part of the record that future observers will use to understand how American political culture evolved during this period. Michael Steele knows this. He has been in politics long enough to understand that individual moments aggregate into historical patterns. And his decision to speak publicly, to use the specific language he used, and to make the specific claims he made reflects an understanding of how political rhetoric functions and how it can be contested. Here's the final point, and it's the one that matters most. This is not ultimately about Donald Trump. It is not ultimately about Michael Steele. It is about the system within which both operate and the public that system is designed to serve. Democratic governance depends on shared understandings about how leaders communicate with citizens. When those understandings break down, when the boundaries of acceptable discourse become genuinely contested rather than broadly agreed upon, the system itself experiences stress. Michael Steele's commentary is one data point in an ongoing assessment of that stress. His claim that Trump expected Americans to accept racist rhetoric is a claim about American political culture, not just about one individual's behavior. It raises questions that extend far beyond any single post or any single politician. What are Americans willing to accept from their leaders? Where are the lines that cannot be crossed? And who has the authority to define and enforce those lines? These are the questions that this moment brings into focus. These are the questions that will shape American politics for years to come. And these are the questions that every citizen, regardless of party or ideology, has a stake in answering. This is the story of a statement that cut through the noise, delivered by a man who knows the machinery of American politics from the inside. Whether his words generate lasting consequences or disappear into the endless churn of the news cycle depends on what happens next. It depends on you.